Hi, good afternoon, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us in person and online. Welcome to the Adaptation Community Meeting. My name is Danielle Miley. I work at USAID in the Global Climate Change Office, and I'm also the COR on the Atlas project, which organizes the Adaptation Community Meeting. So thank you for hosting us. The ACM meets on the third Thursday of every month, and we invite you to join us in January. We will skip December, and please always look at climatlinks.org for the most up-to-date information on the ACMs. But our next one will be on January 18th. The topic will be announced. Hopefully most of you already know the Adaptation Community Meeting is organized by AID, but it's an opportunity for development practitioners from across all sectors, agencies, public, private sector, to convene, get together and discuss current trends, analysis, research, tools, all relating to climate change adaptation. So if this is your first time, welcome. I will let our speakers introduce themselves, but briefly, we are very pleased to have Mona Grieser, the former Chief of Party from our USAID Be Secure project from the Philippines, and Paul Violette, Vice President of Environment and Infrastructure at AECOM, and together they will be discussing some of the challenges and opportunities of integrating resilience approaches into water planning and water resources planning. So without further ado, I will pass it off to you. You can just walk around or hold it. Okay.
Thank you. First time for me to join this community. Thanks for having us. I've heard a lot about it. Enjoyed looking at a lot of the materials that you have online. As Danielle mentioned, we're here to talk about Be Secure today. I was the engagement manager on that project. I was the engagement manager in the home office for that project, which recently completed. Mona was the chief of party, and I'll give a bit of background on AECOM, and then this is sort of the outline for the presentation. Mona will work through some of the interesting aspects in resilience and Be Secure. And I'll give a bit more background here. AECOM is an implementing partner of USAID. Maybe some of you know, we've been at it for some time. Some of the projects that are going on at the moment are the Para Agua project. Maybe that's been mentioned in your community somewhat. It's a regional project in LAC and looks at adaptation options, planning, green infrastructure. Another project that's ongoing is the Climate Ready project in the Pacific, also facilitating capacity building and access to finance. And then the third one here is a knowledge management task order where we were putting together these toolkits, recently ended on climate resilient infrastructure. Those may be posted on Climate Links. But AECOM has been present working in the Philippines with USAID for 15 years or so. These projects listed here are past projects that provided a foundation, let's say, for implementation of Be Secure. There was the LENOW project, Philippine Sanitation Alliance, then EcoAsia, WaterLinks, and then ADAPT. We were able to sort of maintain continuous activity through that time. And then Be Secure came about. Now it's ended, but why don't I hand it off to Mona, and she will tell us all about it. I'm here for assistance if you have questions that Mona can't answer.
Just stick with that one. Okay. Good morning. My name is Mona Grieser. As I mentioned, I was the chief of party for the Be Secure project. It's got this incredibly long name, Water Security for Resilient Economic Growth and Stability, but it's essentially called Be Secure by the mission. I'll tell you what I'm not. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not a water engineer. I am a development specialist, and so that's the skills I bring to a project, and that's probably what you're going to hear about today as they relate to adaptation, as they relate to climate change. So, Philippines, yes, some of you have been there already. You know that it's it's an island of, they say, 7,000 islands, a country of 7,000 islands. So not very easy to get around, not very easy to manage in that sense. Very, very much urbanizing. It's been listed as having the highest educational attainment level of any country in the world, including the United States. By UNESCO, it's listed as having one of the best gender equality systems in the world also, certainly in Asia, and I think it's second in the world. So lots of good things happening in the Philippines already with their own assistance. But they are very vulnerable to climate change. They're probably the most vulnerable, not just to climate change, but they're the most at-risk country in the world because they have volcanoes, they have typhoons, they have droughts, they have all kinds of things happening there. So our work was essentially to deal with all of that. When I say limited household access to water, we're talking not just rural areas that have limited access to water, but it's also urban areas. I don't know if you know, but many of the cities in the Philippines, even where they have water utility, will reach maybe 30%, maybe 40%. In Iloilo, they reach 20% of the population of the city. So there's real demand for water beyond just reaching out to rural people. Am I going the right way? Nope. Okay. This was our project. We started out with 20 million originally, and then got another chunk, thank you USAID, to help with the most unfortunate situation that occurred during my period there, and that was the Typhoon Haiyan, the strongest typhoon ever to hit the planet, and to work in Leyte. These were our three big goals. We had other goals. We had 16 subtasks, but these were the goals. And for those subtasks, thank you again, USAID, we had 17 indicators. So it wasn't easy to keep up with everything. We have, no, still going the wrong way. I am not going to be reading all the slides, so if you want to read them fast, my old studies in how the brain functions tells me that you can read them faster than I can talk about them, so I will just talk about what is other more interesting things. We started out only working in 4 cities and rapidly expanded to include other cities and the provinces as well. And by the end of it, we were working in 6 major cities. We had offices in all 6 cities, and we were working in 5 provinces, I believe. We were under USAID Cities Development Initiative, which was trying to find those cities that USAID felt had good possibility for economic growth. Water was one of the resources that they needed for that economic growth, and so they put us into these cities. We had 3 CDI cities in our group. The others were not CDI cities. Sorry, this direction. So when it came to infrastructure, we learned most of our lessons out of Leyte, I think, as did everybody. The damage that was done when Typhoon Haiyan hit was so extensive and so large and so awful in so many ways. And trying to rebuild after it was a huge brought us a huge learning curve. And some of the challenges that we had to face, I'm just going to run these, okay? Just so you can see what some of these things were that we did. But I will talk to you about the challenges as I'm running them. You can imagine what it was like to have maybe 800 NGOs all coming together to work in the same place at the same time. We had all the donors showing up at the same place at the same time. We had airports that were not functioning. We had prices of commodities that skyrocketed. If you tried to buy lumber to do any repairs, if you wanted pipes to do any repair, the prices on these were extraordinary, and the rubbish that came in from other countries as pipes that one could use was not very useful either. We had to be very, very careful and find our way through what was essentially a chaotic mess afterwards. And the chaos was not on the part of the Filipinos, it was really on the part of the entire emergency community that came to help, not that I would want it otherwise. We had two major climatic events. This one we're focusing on because it was the typhoon, it had sea surge, it had winds, high winds, and within a very short time, the city government in Leyte managed to change the building codes to increase the capacity of buildings to live up to wind. One of the things that I found very useful, strangely enough, there was a fairly large expatriate community living in Leyte at the time, even before the influx from all of the NGOs. And many of those folks were based there. They lived there. They had families. They had married into Filipino families. They were very careful about documenting what worked and what didn't work. They really did do a very good job of going around afterwards and saying, well, this friend's roof stayed on. What did he do that was different? This one's pipes disappeared. What did he do that was different? So we learned a lot from that anecdotal sort of experience that these people had. A lot of these kinds of things, problems that came up, had to do with siting, where pipes had been put in by the small water service providers sort of on the side of a hillside without taking into account that hillside was probably going to disappear when it got water soaked. So that was an issue. A lot of the damage that we repaired had to do with not even damage from the water systems themselves. When people found themselves without water, the problem was not so much that the water systems were broken, but that there was no energy. There was no electricity to pump water. And that electricity stayed off for a long time. It frustrated people, so they started breaking the pipes down to see if they could access water. And then we ended up having to repair all those pipes again. So that was one of the things that nobody had thought about when it comes to adaptation. You really need to make those pipes away from people's, where people could access them and destroy them before, so you wouldn't have to repair them. We had a lot of pipes had to be taken these long distances because we could no longer site them where they were before. They were too dangerous. There were too many hillsides, too much exposure to wind. So those had to be redone. These were just a few of the challenges, landslides. There was one other challenge that almost all of these had to face, and certainly the Leyte Metro Water District itself had to face, was that it got hit. The major water utility got badly damaged by the sea surge, but it destroyed their computers, it destroyed their records, it destroyed all of those things. So when they wanted to start it up again, they had no idea who their subscribers were. They had no idea who had been paying up to that point. So a whole lot of the emergency plans that we helped all of our water utilities to work on included things that were not physical, but were definitely needed afterwards for reconstruction and rehabilitation. So Leyte gave us a lot of lessons that we began to use in other places. One of the biggest problems one of the first things that we did when we started our program was to provide contract to Manila Observatory. Some of you may know Manila Observatory as as probably the oldest climate, weather station in the world. It was started by the Spanish a couple hundred years back and has evolved into one of the finest research facilities in the Philippines. So we asked Manila Observatory to do some of the modeling to see what kinds of change we were anticipating in our areas. And for the first time, we were able to downscale the changes to 25-kilometer areas, which is really quite wonderful. Before, the Philippines had regional, they had island-wide, a wide downscaling, but they'd never had it to that point. That was what the mayors needed in order to be able to plan for themselves. So that gave us a whole lot of information that we were then built on for our future activities in adaptation. For example, when we were working with some of these areas, we realized that there was a big difference in Mindanao, between Zamboanga, where they were going to be facing major droughts in the future, much higher temperatures, almost 2 to 3 degrees temperatures within 20 years. And places like Iloilo and Leyte, which were going to experience more and intensive rains, but in very short periods, leading to landslides. They would have to start collecting their rainwater because in between they would get droughts. I don't know if you're aware of it, but even a city like Iloilo has been running a deficit in water for the last 3-4 years. They've been in drought conditions on and off, and we were able to help them to plan for emergencies, to help with secondary water sources for those things. We did a fair amount of twinning. The work that was needed was so different. The needs of one area were so different from the other that we actually relied very heavily on subcontractors who could help us with very specific skill sets and very specific tasks. Albay in the Philippines itself was a very good example of twinning. Albay had won awards for its own preparedness. It had survived the Yolanda. And so we asked Albay to come and help with some of the areas in Leyte to help them rebuild their planning, to help them get their DRRs moving, to help them. And they were very good. They were excellent. And within a year or so, Palo community, for example, in Leyte province, established its disaster risk reduction. The governor put in $1 million into the budget for that area. So very, very excellent, the twinning process that took place. Not all the twinning was in country. Some of it was outside the country. We brought in experts from outside. I think you've already mentioned that we brought in Colorado.
NCAR.
NCAR. The National Center for Atmospheric Research. NCAR in Boulder was brought in to help Pagasa with some of it, to refine its ability to predict what the climate and the weather was going to be like. We also used NCAR in a number of different places at the local level, so we took NCAR to do training in Iloilo and in Leyte and in CDO. So they were very, very useful, very helpful to us. And I believe they're online also with some of the material that they learned and put into research documents. Governance, major tool. As I say, we learned so much. We ended up having to work with city land use plans. We ended up having to work with mayors. We ended up having to work not just with the water utilities, but with the city administrators to make sure that they remained strong in their responses. It was interesting to me that all of this changes and all of this success took place because our team was able to develop a really strong sense of trust with the local administration. We really were very much believed because we were there when they needed us. We had participatory meetings for planning sessions with them each year to say, all right, this is what USAID wants us to do, but what would you like to do that meets up? And then we would respond to those kinds of things. We were able to provide research for research teams, pre-feasibility studies, feasibility studies for additional water resources. Because as I've mentioned, in some of these places, the water resources were totally insufficient for the city that they needed. So part of it was the studies that we did. Those then led to changes in city planning. Strangely enough, water never emerged in city planning, but when we did the vulnerability assessments, we were able to say, look, you really don't want to put a whole housing complex here because it will flood. Our feasibility studies, our vulnerability assessments have shown that this is going to be a floodplain. Don't put people here. Do something else with it. And so it was that kind of backwards and forwards and that helped. So technical studies, lots of technical studies. Technical studies don't always provide you direct impact, but they are so useful to allow the communities and to allow the mayors, to allow the administrators to understand what some of their needs are. And these technical studies were based on the climate results that Manila Observatory had given to us. Apparently, some of the most important, like Zamboanga City, were really important because they had no water. Zamboanga had been in drought for 3 years already. They were beginning to declare their drought problems to their community by November, when they should have been having rain. But by November of the previous year, all through until June the next year when the rain started, they were in drought circumstances and could not provide water. They were having to provide it with bottles. They ended up with major derailed disease problems as a consequence. So, and that was something that we were able to step in and help them with, partially with the derailed disease because we're not a health project, because we brought in other health projects, USAID health projects, to step in and help. One of the interesting things that we did in terms of feasibility is this one here. This is Leyte. Leyte called us, the Leyte water utility called us, and they said, we're concerned. 2 years after Yolanda, they were very worried because they were seeing, they had a treatment plant right on this S-bend, on an oxbow that was forming on their river. And the treatment plant, it risked being isolated because they were getting landslides coming down 2 years after Yolanda. And we had to study why was this happening? Was it going to close off that S-bend? Is it going to push water, that whole river? Is that suddenly going to go downstream and hit all of the communities downstream? Would Leyte, the entire city of Leyte, be without water? So they asked us to come in and do a study to see whether that hillside was going to go. And because there was only a 40-foot gap, okay, where the river was coming through, and it was coming through at faster and faster paces. So we hired a firm to go in and do the hydrological studies for that. What was interesting in that was that, in fact, the gap was not going to go. That hillside was pretty solid. We did quite a bit of measurements of soils and groundwater. The gap was not going to go. What they didn't realize was that this entire bank was going to go. And that was, they hadn't even looked at the bank. Had that bank gone, their treatment facility would have gone too. Not the intake, but the treatment. They were worried about the intake. We showed them that it was their treatment facility that was going to go sand, rocks, whatever. And as a consequence of that, then the mayor and the governor came through and put in $54,000 to repair the banks. So these were some of the things that came out with the challenges that you face. Just to let you know, we were allowed to use drones.
Yeah.
We were allowed to use drones. The first time USAID allowed drones to be used for this kind of thing. And the reason is we needed to know what was going on uphill. Where was this landslide coming from? And it turns out that when the winds hit Yolanda, they took down 1/3 of the trees in the watershed. Nobody realized this until after the landslides began. So these are some of the things that we did while we were there in terms of resources. We realized when we found so many areas that were going to be suffering from drought, and we remember we went through an El Nino as well. California was desperate. We were desperate too. We needed to do a bit more. And that was when we started to introduce the concept of water demand management and water conservation to the Philippines. Interestingly for me, who had done water demand management in Jordan, it had never occurred to the Filipinos that this was a model that they could use. Demand management was something that they needed. Filipinos had always expected that they would always have water, they get rains, they get typhoons. Why would they need conservation? This was why they needed it. Drought was facing them in a lot of different places. Water demand management was very new, so we started out by working with the Zamboanga water utility to train them not only to prepare the larger public for demand and conservation, but also to prepare some of the, but to understand how they could save water. In other words, the water that they had was the most precious water that they could use. It was much cheaper than going out and building new dams, which is the next step in what they were going to be doing. In a lot of places, water demand management required that we look at NRW, non-revenue water reduction, and that we look at conservation measures. Zamboanga jumped on the conservation. We taught their staff to do water audits of large buildings. They learned how much they could possibly save of water. Very excited about it. They have a SWAT team, they call them now, Zamboanga Water Audit Team, but all dressed in black as if they were men in black already. And they go out when they're asked, and they do water audits, and they show people how to cut the water use in their buildings. But they're also providing training now for all of the Philippine Association of Water Providers, PAWAD. All of them are moving on their own. They really bought the concept of water demand management. It was something that was very new and innovative for them. We teamed them up with Seattle. Seattle Public Utilities, I don't know if you're aware of it, in the United States is considered to be one of the foremost conservation models around. And we brought 2 of their staff out to the Philippines to give a series of talks about it. We brought initially, even before that, we brought some really high-powered people from both the Water Association. We brought from Jordan the ex-minister of Water to explain what Jordan had gone through and why Jordan had decided to go through this step. Wonderful, wonderful experience. We needed the policymakers to be on board so that you could start to make some of the other changes. Water demand management catalyzed really the water sector in the Philippines. Within a year, they were already putting ordinances in place. They were already passing laws under the new water codes. They were putting those in that had to do with water demand management. Very impressive group. Twinning also with, in Seattle, we took a group to Seattle. Cold, January, freezing cold, but they loved it. They learned so much. They went out to the watershed dressed like little bundles of coal, but they loved it. They learned so much. They came back excited. We took not just central Manila utilities, people, decision makers, but we took the utilities from and twinned them with their mayors and other city personnel, so that when they came back, they could talk together about which ordinances needed to be in place, what did they need to do. So they loved it. And we took all of our 4 cities went with us. NRW reduction, the first place you start when you're losing water. And all of the utilities in the Philippines are suffering from NRW problems. Some of them, like Zamboanga, had already contracted with Manila Water to help them to get their NRW under control. Some of them, like Iloilo Water Utility, was under a potential concession agreement with MetroPac. One of the things that happened while we were there, and I really think that it was partially the work of Be Secure, was that people began to understand that there was money to be made in the water sector. All of a sudden, a number of these very large water companies, like MetroPac, like Manila Water, like Prime Water, all of a sudden they began to eye these smaller cities like CDO, Iloilo, to see whether or not they could come in, take over the concessions, and make money off them. They have a lot of money, these big water utilities. By now, yes? Non-revenue water. Sorry. Non-revenue water is when water is piped from source. Before it gets to a household, it's the amount of water that is lost into the pipes in between, in the system. It is lost partially because the pipes are old and decrepit, or there have been leaks, or because somebody has deliberately cut into the pipes to try and steal some water and not pay the bills. But mostly in the Philippines, it's actually because of the leakage within the system. So non-revenue water is a huge problem. In CDO, where they asked us to come in and help because they didn't want to turn over their utility to a concessionaire, we came in, we provided them with an expert contract firm that would help them to decide how to go about building non-revenue, how to reduce their non-revenue water. CDO pumps enough water for a city of about 800,000. They lose 58% of that water in their pipes. Okay? That's more than half. All right? So as a consequence, they're servicing less than 30% of the people. So they were very interested in getting that water handled. We provided them with a GIS database that monitored where all these places, where the pipes were, where the leaks might be. We did, I don't want to get into DMAs, but you can break a city up into grids and then check each grid to see where there's water leakage, put on meters on each grid to see where there's water moving. They were able to help CDO. The expectation is that they would help CDO bring their water NRW down a full 30%. That 30% CDO promised they would then turn over to expansion into new areas that were no longer getting water. Why was it difficult? Nobody has any records. There are no paperwork to show where these old pipes were. In CDO, the Cagayan de Oro, they had two people, a little older than me, two gentlemen who worked in the utility that remembered where some of these pipes were. One of those gentlemen unfortunately died while we were working with them. So they had one person who knew where these pipes were. That's why the importance of the GIS database. They needed to figure out, finally, lay the maps out, figure out where these pipes are so they could go back in and repair them in the future. That was CDO. CDO itself, the city, borrowed 480 million pesos so that they could pay for their share of it. We got Coca-Cola to chip in with about $300,000. We chipped in with about $500,000. We, meaning USA, thank you. You're going to take credit for all of USA, it's all right. Sorry? National Development Bank. Well, that's to CDO. That was their loan. Yeah, that was their loan. That was proved a challenge in itself because getting that money took 5 years for them. When we were there, we only had 2 years to go. So for them to get only half the money while we were still there meant that they couldn't finish it all while we were still around. So those are the kinds of challenges that you sometimes face in these areas. Water demand management, I've already mentioned it. We brought in international experts. We had national level policy that was drafted. We had senators that jumped on the bandwagon, realized that in their communities it was really going to be of great help. And so WDM became sort of the poster child for the face of water in the Philippines. One of the things that we did beyond this was to launch a good communication campaign, to allow people to understand that, yes, you've been accustomed to water. Your grandparents never had to worry about shortages, but you're going to face it in the future. So it's up to you now to decide what you want to do. We put out all kinds of materials to help the public understand. While we were helping businesses understand, we also helped the general public, households. They needed to be on board if there were going to be changes in ordinances, if there was going to be changes in the building codes that required them to be suddenly more efficient with the fixtures that they put into buildings. So we needed everyone to basically understand, and these were some of the things that we did with them. We put together a business alliance that helped to push with the business world some of the same things that they could be doing in their own businesses that would help them. Obviously, with them, it wasn't water that was the bottom line. It was saving money. The more money you can save by using efficient fixtures, the better off you are as a business. That was their thing. And the same thing, we used the same thing for households. We didn't tell them, you're doing your country a favor. We learned that what they really needed was how to help them in their pocketbooks. I haven't talked Septage, but Septage became a major part of our work. First few years, a little bit difficult. We took people on. Septage is always something difficult to talk about. It's always NIMBY. But we had a very good septage team, sewerage. There's only two places in the Philippines that actually have sewerage. One is Manila itself, and only a small amount of people in Manila. And the other, strangely enough, is Zamboanga, where the Americans put in a sewage plant, 130 in 1930. So that was still functioning. What we started to do was help them to build that into a treatment plant as well. They collected the sewage, but they never treated it, and it just went into the ocean. But we jump-started in a number of places septage facilities. We learned from the Yolanda experience that you could use septage, particularly lime stabilization programs, for smaller towns. It works. You didn't have to have sewerage. And in a number of our cities, eventually, we started to get septage ordinances. We started to get facilities dug and put in. It was very, very impressive how fast the cities understood how useful septage would be both to health and to the quality of their water if they put them in. So, what were our final results? I am winding down, I promise. These were some of the major results that we had in the program. USAID, I think, was very happy with us. I mentioned to somebody that our CPARs got pretty high, but that wasn't why we were doing the work. We were doing the work because we felt like we were really responding to people's needs. You could tell that in the responses that we got from people in the field. Our staff were very dedicated. Our staff worked very hard. They earned the trust of people. And again, some remarkable results came out of it. So, what else? This is our key takeaways. You can take a picture of this. I'm not going to talk about it. I already have. If there's any questions, I think we're about ready for those.
Yeah, great. We have the room until 5:30, so we'll start Q&A. Please wait until you have the mic to speak. We do have a webinar audience who can only hear if you're speaking through the mic. So with that, I'll open it up to Q&A.
And just remember, I'm not an engineer and I'm not a climate change scientist. Okay.
Add a comment. Danielle Miley again with USAID in the Climate Change Office. Thank you, Mona, for the presentation. I just want to reiterate, it wasn't just your CPARs. It was a really great project, and it's really a great illustration of how USAID and our partners help countries become more resilient to climate impacts. And it's just such a wonderful example of how in this project you worked on improving access to climate information for better decision-making at the local level, helped improve governance, also employed best practices through infrastructure, and then supported also with financing those adaptation approaches. So I just want to say from our perspective, it was a great illustration of that work, and thank you for the presentation.
I'm saying thank you on behalf of my team. Okay, they're not here. I wish they were. I truly wish they were. They were extraordinary.
Hi, Charlotte Germain-Aubrey from MCC. Great presentation. Thank you very much. I was wondering when you mentioned that you used the drones to actually look at the causes of the landslide and figured out that a third of the trees had been taken down by Yolanda. I was wondering if, in a sort of integrative management perspective, did you end up doing any natural resource management in your project?
We did IWRM in Iloilo, but not in Leyte. There is another USAID project that was doing integrated water management. So no, it wasn't in our mandate to get into these areas. And one of the reasons we used drones, frankly, was because it was difficult to get into otherwise. These were, relatively mountainous areas of Leyte province. It's an area that had been used before by rebels. In fact, there were probably even some rebels still hiding out in it. I didn't mention that a lot of our work was Mindanao-based and conflict area-based. Then again, I give kudos to my staff that they were willing to go down there. They worked hard there. A lot of our results came from Mindanao. Yeah.
Hi, Ken Andrasco, a freelance consultant. I was really impressed by your leveraging the money. So you had 21 million originally from aid, and then you had 42 million, I think the number was, in public and private. Can you say a little bit about that? Usually people are struggling to get 5% or 10%. How did you end up with such a big number?
Philippine government has put aside quite a bit of funds to help water utilities. It's not always easy for them to get a hold of it, but there is funding there. The provincial governors have money. Some of our money came from the provincial governors. I will say the bulk of it came from CDO and from the 450 million pairing that they did with us. Initially, they wanted us to pay for the whole thing. We said, no, you're going to have to take out the loan. They took out the loan. They matched us. So that was part of it. Another large chunk, by far the largest chunk, came from Iloilo when MetroPac came in with the concession. Iloilo City asked us to help to negotiate the concessions with MetroPac. They didn't want to be left high and dry or taken lose all their staff or whatever it is, lose their jobs if MetroPac came in and decided to take it over. That concession agreements that should have taken maybe a year took 23 months by the time it finally finished with the back and forth. But we hired a firm, we hired lawyers, we hired engineers, we hired water experts to come in and monitor what MetroPac was proposing, make sure that it was. And when MetroPac finally got the concession in May 2017, it was that tight. When they finally signed it, they agreed to put in 86 million over the next dollars US over the next 86 billion over the next 50 years. But in the next 5 years, they were willing to put in 45 million to repair the NRW, put in new pipes, expand the system. And because they had signed it, USAID agreed that we could accept the responsibility for that 45 million because we had been with them the full 23 months trying to get them to sign it. We brought MetroPac, we negotiated with them, we were there in the room all the time. It was a guarantee. Yeah.
Lawrence Bouja from NCAR. Given the magnitude of the right now problems you were dealing with, 53% loss of your non-revenue water, 2 cities with sewage treatment, were the climate tools that you developed of that much interest to them, or were they more interested in solving right now problems?
I think both. I think truly both. Obviously, immediately they needed something right away. They needed something for their own senior decision makers. They needed something that they could take to the general public. But remember, we only had 5 cities. There's I think 37 cities in the Philippines that are about the same level as the 5 or 6 that we were working with. They were very interested, and when we gave our materials to, for example, the POED, they were very, very interested in those. They were interested in the climate change work that NCAR was doing in particular, and I'm glad you brought that up. Pagasa really profited. We sent Pagasa staff. Does anybody know what Pagasa is? Pagasa is the Philippine. It's their. What did you call it? The agency? Yeah, it's their meteorological agency. Yeah. So Pagasa really benefited from the training that they got from NCAR. We sent 2 people to NCAR. We brought NCAR out multiple times. They were useful. They weren't just for immediate use. They were the long range, and particularly when we gave them the Manila Observatory tools that showed what would happen in 2020, what would happen in 2030, what would happen in 2050. They bought it. They bought it. They were happy to start working on some of these other things right away. Yeah, the tools were very useful, particularly the infrastructure one. Right after Leyte, that was very useful. Anything else? Yeah.
Mona, thanks. Jeffrey Blate with USAID. I actually have several questions, so pardon me. And they're not engineering questions. See, you mentioned lessons that you learned sort of midstream because of Haiyan. And I'm just wondering, are those documented in some report that is on the deck? And
there's an infrastructure report on the deck, much of which came from Haiyan. There's an infrastructure toolkit, actually, that came from Haiyan. What else? There's a climate change toolkit that came from Haiyan that's also on the deck. Yeah, there are a number of these.
So
we put
there's
out
somehow
7 toolkits, I think, in the end, 7 different documents.
And those consolidate all the lessons.
Yes.
Thanks.
Yes.
Okay. Another question I have is post-Haiyan, you said that you were learning all these lessons, and you showed in photos some of the ways that you reinforced some of the water infrastructure to basically withstand future events. I'm just wondering, I guess it's only been a few years, but have any of them been tested?
Yes.
And what was the result?
Yes. Within a very short time, we had 3 other typhoons, maybe not quite as strong as Haiyan, but major typhoons. Those areas where we were able already to put up, in fact, those areas that we'd already put up buildings, not a problem. Never a problem at all.
Just to build on Ken's question about finance, and you mentioned some of the difficulties in mobilizing finance. The city took several years just to convince the bank. Is one of the results of the project some mindset change in the financing mobilization prospects? Like, has the government had more success? The municipalities, I suppose, not at the national level, but accessing finance either through public or other private means? Have they thought about using green bonds, because those have been used in other places? Just curious about that.
I obviously don't know about the green bonds question. I don't think that's something that's been thought of. In the Philippines right now, they have a fair amount of money that's still tied up that hasn't been accessed. I'll give you an example of where some of the money is tied up and why it's tied up. In working on the sewerage problem with Zamboanga City, Zamboanga City is the one city that could have improved its sewerage, and they had it ready. We had helped them with the feasibility studies. We knew where it went. We knew exactly what it would cost. NSSMP, the National Sanitation something of the Philippines. The Philippines is always in acronyms, so yeah, they always talk in acronyms. So NSSMP has money. NSSMP's money is managed by DPWH, the Department of Public Works and Highway. They finally got excited about loosening some of this money for those cities that could use it for sewerage. We were under the DPWH as a project. We came in under that department. At the time that we came in, Secretary Sing Song was the secretary for the project. He had for the department. He had been at one time the head of Manila Water. We anticipated that with somebody who knew water at the head of the agency, we would get speed. It didn't happen that way. Not quite sure why. I have my suspicions, and I think it may have to do with the fact that so many of the water suddenly saw opportunity and didn't want government to step in and release money to individual cities and utilities. That may be one of the reasons. But in any case, NSSMP came up with money for sewerage, but they limited it only to those cities that could put in sewers. So there's big money available, but sewerage is expensive, and the cities had to come up with matching funds. That was very difficult for them. Septage they could do. We tried to persuade DPWH to allow septage instead of sewerage. They didn't accept it. I understand, excuse me, that it was on the docket for after we left for them to reconsider this. I don't know yet if it's gone through, but at the time it was just for sewerage. Zamboanga was supposed to receive the first tranche of sewerage money. They got the approval. They got everything from NSSMP, but NSSMP didn't have a protocol for transferring money from center to a water utility. So then we had to wait until the protocols were in place, until everybody could be sure that the money wasn't going to be abused, used for something else, etc. So all of these things ended up losing time for us. They live with it. They live with it. Philippines has gone through many, many years of corruption, and now they're trying to tighten up as much as possible, and as a consequence, money is hard to get hold of.
Sorry, I mean, if other people have questions.
Thank you. Brian Knapp from Comonix. As you were tightening up the systems for non-revenue water, obviously that means some people who were getting water presumably didn't no longer get water. They were, I guess, stealing or tapping in the water. But I'm just wondering what that was like in the communities. Did you get a lot of pushback in the communities, or did people more or less accept that it shouldn't have been happening? I can imagine, I guess, some people not being happy about what we're looking at as efficiency in the system. That leakage was being put to use. So was there an issue in the communities?
I think you'll find that people in the Philippines are very patient. They've put up with poor service for so many years that they kind of get accustomed to not having the best of service. And I think they were very excited that the idea that maybe they were going to soon get improvements. We got some pushback. Well, the government had some pushback from, for example, the mayor of Iloilo, very frustrated that it took 23 months for MetroPac to come in and make this agreement, because he was a very forward-thinking mayor. He had businesses lined up to come in to the city, but no water. And he was afraid they would go to other cities. So yes, we got a little frustration from some of these people. But it was mostly at the decision-maker level that the frustrations came from mayors. I didn't mention that one of the things that we lived through, Typhoon Haiyan, El Nino, we also lived through a presidential election. And in the Philippines, presidential elections go from the president all the way down to the local barangay chief. So everybody could change possibly in the system. And once they change, it's very much like here. The priorities differ, the changes, the policies differ, and we had to live through that too. So that was another issue. Nobody wanted to make decisions. Nobody is allowed to make decisions and give contracts in the 6 months prior to the election even. So in CDO, we needed them to get their money so they could quickly give out the contracts for laborers, for buying the meters, for all of this kind of stuff. Couldn't do it. Had to wait until after the election. So frustrations of working in the developing countries. This is why we're there. No, the people, very good. Paul, did you have anything you wanted to add to these? You've been in and out.
You didn't talk about the video.
The video. We did, as part of our public communication effort, we made a video with a very well-known Filipina actor on water conservation in the home.
Tell everyone his name. Ding Dong.
Ding Dong. Ding Dong, yes. Ding Dong made a film for us, and we wrote it as a storyline. We didn't do it as a, this is what climate change is. Here's how we started out that way, and then pretty soon realized it wasn't going to work. We also aimed it. We did our research, and even in communication, we aimed it at the bulge that is young people in the Philippines coming out of university who are going to be moving up the ranks, going to be buying homes, buying cars, living in apartments. They're the ones that we wanted to reach. They're the 70% of Filipinos now. There's a huge bulge there. And so we aimed it at them. And that film has been playing everywhere, everywhere.
How long was it? 20, 30 minutes?
No. It was finally cut down to 9 minutes.
Okay. It seems like a heartthrob, right?
He's very definitely a heartthrob, yeah. Ding Dong Dante.
That on the website?
Yeah, I think it is. It's in YouTube. It's on YouTube. If you go to YouTube and you look for Be Secure film, Ding Dong Dante, there can't be too many of them. It is. We did it as a small soap opera. It's got English subtitles. It's in Tagalog, but it's got English subtitles. So,
okay,
yeah.
We have a question from online. So a couple of questions. The first is, how did you ensure resiliency of local government units, communities, and civil society organizations to maintain, manage, and sustain the adaptation measures you installed? And related to that, if you could speak a little bit more about the M&E programs used to track the effectiveness of these measures over the long term.
Okay. Resiliency. A huge chunk of our work was just plain training, bringing in, explaining to people what the climate changes were going to be in their areas, what the adaptation measures were that they could take, helping them develop plans and emergency plans, working with them in participatory, what you call it? I'm blanking out. Sorry, senior moment. Anyway, having them develop some of their own plans in a very participatory manner, so that they could understand better what their needs were and what the issues were, where the risks were. So a lot of that resiliency came from having them do their own work. I'm not using resiliency in the correct IPCC term, I know. In trying to do improved demand management, in trying to improve NRW, we assumed that there would be resiliency there, that there would be less energy usage in pumping, they would reach out to more people, there would be less tapping of new resources, new wells. There was a real demand to try and dig wells to satisfy the drought issues. And we tried to discourage them from that because some of those wells were already tapped out, some of the wells were already contaminated. That was Zamboanga's problem when they got their diarrheal disease issues, was that the wells were already contaminated. They dropped to a level that was too low. It was city plans. I don't know if you saw them in city plans, ordinances. Those were some of the methodologies for resilience that decision makers came up with. M&E. Aside from the 17 indicators that we had that we monitored very, very closely, we had an M&E staff. We double-checked everything. We would work with local government who would send us lists of things that, new people who had come on board. We worked with the water service providers to give us accurate numbers of how many new people were getting water now. Quite often we didn't rely only on them. We did sample surveys ourselves to go out to them and make sure that they were actually reaching a number of people, that they had used the money that government gave to them for expansion. So we double-checked everything. We had a very, very good M&E unit. USAID has come in a number of times to double-check our data. I'm not sure what you want me to say about M&E. M&E was just stuff we did. It was part of everything. Every activity we did had an M&E component.
Okay, one more question online. There's an increasing interest at USAID in preventing conflict. Can you speak to the intersection of water, climate, and conflict in Mindanao?
Yes. One of the reasons that USAID asked us to work in Mindanao was the hope that because of, if we were able to provide more resources, if we were able to provide some security of resources, it would help the security situation. And to some extent, they're correct in that. There's some real frustration. Somebody brought it up here. There's real frustration in not having water and not being able to have electricity. So in not being able to put in companies, not having jobs, not having clinics working, people were very excited when we were able to come in and put in facilities for them. There were challenges even in that. We helped to rebuild a clinic in Mindanao, and all the facilities were in place. All we needed to do was connect it to the water pipes. And the hospital and the mayor said no, they didn't want it. And the reason was that they were from a different faction than the governor who had helped to provide the money for it, and they didn't want it. Eventually we got some agreement, and that's because we ended up doing a fair amount of conflict resolution in our work. We needed it in CDO. We held meetings to bring together the different parties in CDO because the mayor and the water utility were at odds. We needed it in Malawi, the island of Malawi, which is a small island off the island of Basilan. Basilan is way south, very close. It's in the middle of the conflict area. And Malawi is a tiny little island of about 5,000 people, where the Abu Sayyaf has its headquarters. But they had no water. And those 5,000 people needed water. Basilan Water Utility would ferry over water in a boat to them. They had water in a pipe that had been put in under the sea to the island. That pipe had been broken, and so they had no water. They asked us if we would go and do some experimentation, some research to see if they could dig a well, whether there was fresh water under Malawi. We found out there was. It was a little risky because it took us almost a year to find a firm that was willing to go to Malawi and dig. But eventually we found somebody. We got permission and support through the water utility. We didn't get it ourselves, through the water utility. We had the Navy come in and build the ramps to bring so that the equipment could get into the island. The Navy had brought the cranes in on their ships because there was no other way to get it onto this island. That was all arranged by the water utility. That was their responsibility. But eventually we did manage to get water to Malawi, and it's one of the highlights, frankly, of USAID, I think, that this funny little community, totally in the middle of a conflict area, actually got water from USAID. And the head of Abu Sayyaf was very pleased. What can I say? We never had any trouble. We had guards, but they never stole anything in our work. So it was an interesting thing. Did we avoid water as a consequence of avoid the insecurities? No, obviously not. Those of you who've watched Maramawi would know that, in fact, no, we didn't. It wasn't our job to do that. We were just helping to try and reduce some of the insecurity. We weren't responsible for it.
Hi. My name is Andrew Baker from Chemonics. I had some questions about revenue collection, the profitability of the water companies. It sounds like they're profitable because the companies continue to want to be involved. And then just capital reinvestment and creating long-term sustainability.
Okay, you're almost out of my area of expertise. Yes, the major water companies are very profitable. And when I'm talking about major ones, they're mostly the ones that work out of Manila. Manila Water, Manila, the Metro Pac, Prime Water. Many of them are providers not only of direct water services to citizens, but they also are responsible for water from the watershed. You know, they provide the bulk water. So they make money in many, many ways in water. Many of them have other interests. Metro Pac is a huge, huge firm. It does investments in water in a number of different places, not just even in the Philippines. They're bigger. They do investments outside the Philippines. So yes, they have money. Do the utilities themselves in the small, in the cities that we worked in, do they have money? They collect money. They have enough for what they're doing. They don't expand because they don't have extra money. They don't want to accumulate extra debt, so they don't take the loans out from the government. CDO was a rare case that didn't want to give up its concession to a large firm and was willing to take out the loan and figured over time they would be able to get that money back and pay it back. So yes, there is a problem at the small city level. They're never going to have the money for the kinds of secondary water sources they need. We did feasibility studies for dams. We did feasibility studies for secondary water sources. Those take big money. They don't have that kind of money, the utilities. That's something government is going to have to step in. If you look at there's a report that was written about the risk assessments that we did. We did a risk assessment in looking at 2013 data, and then a risk assessment looking at 2016 data. And it's the one indicator in our results that didn't look as good as the rest. And part of it is because while we did all the soft risk work, the hard stuff that needed to be done, the dams that needed to be built, the wall around Leyte, which the Japanese are now constructing to keep the sea, it's the seawall to keep the sea out, those things are beyond a USAID project. So, and because the money wasn't there for those, the big money wasn't there for those, we couldn't really say that these were cities whose risk had diminished completely. CDO has a river, for example, which needs better flood banks. That's construction on a level that USAID projects don't do, and certainly we weren't supposed to do it. So that city is still at risk from flooding. It's not at risk anymore from NRW, but it is at risk from flooding. Because they've borrowed that $480 million, I don't know where they're going to get the money for the rest of it. Japan may be willing to come in and help them with that. The JICA is, they've talked about coming in and doing some of that work. World Bank is putting $75 million into water this coming year. So there is more money coming in. Are they able to survive on what they have? I don't know. At the moment, yes. At the moment, yes. Let me just give you very quickly one example. Basilan, the water utility in Basilan, it's run by a grandmother like me. She's a marvelous lady. She came in when the water utility was broke, and she was a manager in the administration at DPWH. They just transferred her there and said, get it under control. She's been there 5 years. In that 5 years, she managed to bring it up. It had money. It built its own water. It built its own sewer, its septage facility. They put in the Malawi facility themselves. They put in all of that stuff. How did she do it? She used what little money that they had. They bought a resort. The resort makes money for them. She bought a rubber plantation. She uses the gray water from the sewage facility to feed the rubber plantation. She sells the rubber. She makes money. So there are ways. They're very clever, very, very clever. I have nothing but admiration for these people. And in order to build that sewage, she had to fight the mayor, who wanted 10% of the profits, without putting a penny in. So there are lots of challenges. Sorry, I didn't mean to take up excess time here. Sometimes anecdotes are more fun. Yeah.
Definitely. My name is Erin Martin. I work on the Atlas project, and I'd like to ask a question that may sound a little cynical on the surface, but it's motivated by wanting to understand what prompts major change. And that is, would any of this have been possible without the typhoon, without Haiyan? Would you have been able to affect all of this change without that?
Yes, it would have been possible. And I think it wasn't Haiyan that so much that did it. It was the Manila Observatory results. Having the results downscaled to 25 kilometers seriously made people sit up and take notice. The El Nino helped. Suddenly realizing that the hot weather you felt is going to be what most of the year is going to be like in future, that helped. But yes, people were willing to accept research results because they trusted the source. They trusted Manila Observatory, and over time they trusted us. And as a consequence of those two, I think we were able to make real inroads into change.
Hi, Ken Andrasco. Can I just follow up on that? You showed some of the forecast results, the baseline, and then the forecast, and I'm not sure what time frame it was,
Okay.
2030 or something.
Yeah.
It interested me that you say that the results drove some of the politics, but there was very little difference between the forecast and the baseline in any of the four examples that you gave. It was probably within the uncertainty band. So I'm just curious, there must have been other kinds of research that were somehow more influential?
No, those results are actually fairly shocking if you look at them. I'm sorry, I didn't bring the big slides with me, but if you those are all published. They're on the deck. If you're interested in those, they're actually quite large. We looked at, for example, in Cotabato City. Cotabato City was anticipating a temperature increase of between 2 and 4 degrees. That may not seem a lot. Philippines has already calculated that for every degree of temperature increase, they lose 15% of their rice crop. It's a big deal. It may not look much on a little chart, but it's a big deal for them. Knowing that their rainfall is going to diminish and the period of rainfall is going to become much smaller, that's a big deal. Knowing that they were going to get more intensive rains. I don't know if you watched about a year ago, CDO, which had already done its emergency plan with us. They were prepared, they were ready, they had all the people mobilized, they knew who was going to do what if there was going to be an emergency, but they had based it on a typhoon. They hadn't based it on a depression that was just going to hang over the darn city and just feed water to them over and over and over the days that followed until they totally flooded. If you've seen any of the pictures, they were up to 9 feet of water just from rain. And they weren't able to mobilize because they hadn't anticipated it in their emergency plan. So they had to go back to the drawing board. Somebody asked me about resilience. They went back themselves and realized this is something they needed to put into their emergency plans. We didn't have to bring in another expert to show them how to change that. They did it themselves. Yes, it's a big deal. It's a big deal.
I think you can leave the hot seat. Thank you so much, Mona, for the presentation, and all of you for joining online and in person, and we'll see you in January.
Thank you.